Yes, now I see recording.
To the first talk in our series on Realizing Radical Hope with Dr. Danny Bernard Martin. I am going to tell you a little bit about the Earl Center, and then Greg Benoit is going to share something about this series and some norms that we hope to establish for this conversation. And then we'll hear from Dr. Martin, and then we'll have a conversation all together. Do
you want to share your screen?
I will share. Let me present that first.
Yeah.
Share. So the Earl Center for Learning and Innovation is at Boston University Wheelock College of Education and Human Development. The vision for the Earl Center for Learning and Innovation is that it's a collaborative space for social dreaming and radical hope, space where youth and adults, learners and teachers, researchers and designers join together in expansive inquiry to develop educational experiences animated by commitments to creativity, dignity, and justice. Our mission is, as a participatory research community, we're committed to developing learning ecologies that are creatively responsive to the complexities of the world as it is and as it could be. We work at the intersections of STEM, humanities, and the arts, where we design ecologies where youth grow as engaged and critical authors of connected social futures. Stop share. Greg.
Yeah, sorry, I was also on mute and, getting the hang of this. So we're so excited to have you all here for our inaugural event in our community engagement series, Realizing Radical Hope. So thank you for joining. And when we speak of realizing radical hope, we are centering criticality and creativity as connected sensibilities needed to disrupt dominant structures of oppression, and reimagining alternative liberatory possibilities for learning and thriving that could be. So we ask that we kind of take this time to just, take a scan of who was able to kind of join us today. So if you can introduce yourselves on the chat, feel free to drop your name, feel free to drop your role, your institution, or however you feel as though you want to be introduced or known in the actual space. Also, I just wanted to mention that you can find us and follow us on Twitter at BU Earl Center with CTR. I'm going to kind of drop that into the chat as we speak. Everyone in meeting, cool. And so for those who are on social media or have a social media presence, we ask that you kind of use the hashtag radical hope for anything that you're hearing, seeing, or enjoying within the actual talk in itself, so that we kind of expand these spaces past just this meeting and keep conversations ongoing. I'll be sharing a read-only document with you in a little bit that kind of has our community norms, that has our instructions, and that has features links of today's actual discussion. So also, I just want to be able to ask if you need closed captioning, you should find a button on the bottom of your Zoom to access the closed captioning. All right. So I'm going to drop this link in the chat, and it should be a view-only document. So let me know if you do not have, or if you're having trouble accessing that. Also, as you can tell, this discussion is being recorded. So we'll be also sharing this on BU Wheelock's webpage as well. So I believe, Eli, you're going to introduce Dr. Danny Martin.
Thanks, Craig. Dr. Denny Bernard Martin is Professor of Education and Mathematics at the University of Illinois, Chicago, where he has twice served as Department Chair for Curriculum and Instruction. He teaches content and methods courses in mathematics and in elementary education, as well as courses in a PhD program. Prior to joining UIC, he was an instructor and professor at Contra Costa College for 14 years. And I share that because he has a strong commitment to both teaching and scholarship. Dr. Martin's research has focused primarily on understanding the salience of race and identity in Black learners' mathematical experiences across family, school, and societal contexts. He has authored and edited several books and articles on mathematics learning in Black children. He currently serves as co-principal investigator of National Science Foundation project with Omo Moses from the Young People's Project and Math Talk, and with a couple of folks here from BU, Kathy O'Connor and Nermeen Dashush, that's embedding mathematical experiences for young children in everyday neighborhood experiences. So we invited Dr. Martin to speak today because he has made substantial contributions to the ways the field thinks about and conducts research in mathematics education and identity, and really learning in general. For Black children, including shifting deficit narratives and narratives about gaps of nameless students to, as one of his book titles states, the brilliance of Black children as human beings and as people whose lives matter. We believe he forces us all to rethink not only what we mean when we use the word equity as it applies to Black children, but also why we engage children in learning in the first place. We look forward to the conversation today. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Martin.
Thank you, Eli. I'm going to go ahead and try to get the share screen to work here. So bear with me for 1 second. Okay, is that working? Okay, thank you. Let me, before getting into the conversation and discussion of the paper, I think I have about 20 minutes to talk. I don't know how far I'll get, but at the 20-minute mark, feel free to just cut me off because whatever I would say after that would be in the paper. I want to start by thanking the folks at the Earl Center for the invitation to share my work and perspective today. I want to thank you all for joining on the call. I don't see all of you, but I know you're out there. And I appreciate you joining, especially in this time when many of us are probably suffering a little bit from Zoom fatigue and a number of other issues going on in the world. I want to give a quick shout out to my two colleagues over there, Kathy and Nermeen, as Eli has already done. These are my two co-PIs in one of the grants we're working on with Omo Moses. And I also want to shout out, I don't know if he's in the audience, but I want to give a shout out to Frank Davis, who I seem to run into quite a bit when I give talks here and there across the country every now and then when we were able to travel. But Frank is someone who has been in the game, as they say, a long time. And I certainly respect the fact that he continues to sort of stay abreast and stay sharp on these issues. And he gives me sort of a bit of inspiration in terms of role modeling, in terms of how I hope to be in this field. Yeah, the title of the paper is Equity, Inclusion, Anti-Blackness in Mathematics Education. And I'm going to go ahead and start with a few slides that I want to share with you. And at some point, I will come to the end of these slides, but I think I'm going to go ahead and just kind of move forward. So if you had a chance to see the paper, read it, take a look at it, I'm going to start with one of the main positions that I map out in the paper. And as you're reading that text, if you decide to, essentially it says that equity and inclusion are really insufficient logic and justice models for addressing the needs of Black children in mathematics. And what I try and do in the paper is map out how I see that argument playing out. And what I want to do for the next 20 minutes is provide some context for where this particular stance on equity and inclusion comes from. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to first share a couple of points about my background in terms of how I actually got to this point, and also want to talk a bit about some specifics in the paper as well. I'm not highlighting everything, obviously. So Eli gave a bit of biographical sketch for me, and I'll just add a couple of extra things here. As he said, I'm a professor of education and mathematics at UIC. I've been teaching math since 1987. That's quite a long time. I was in California up until the year 2004, and I've been teaching math and education at UIC since that time. My research is on Black learners, and I started about 1991. And more personally, the personal and the professional always blend together, but more personally, I'm also the father of a brilliant 8-year-old son. And I should say I'm the son of an 81-year-old and a 77-year-old set of parents. And I mentioned these last two bullets because I think they give me sort of a multi-generational perspective on issues of equity and inclusion. So I can think back vicariously through the lives of my two parents, one of them who was very vocal about the racial terror that she has experienced in this country, both North and South. My father is less vocal, my mother is much more vocal. And having an 8-year-old son, it also requires that I think about the future in terms of how these issues of equity and inclusion may play out for him in his life. My research, as Eli said, it focuses on issues of race and identity. I'm especially interested in how Black children, Black learners see themselves and construct their own meaning for their position in the world, and also in mathematics, and how they see themselves as doers, creators, and learners of mathematics in both school and non-school contexts. There's two questions. I know it's pretty difficult sometimes to narrow down one's research agenda, but these are the questions that have been sort of pulling me in different directions for about 30 years or so. And they're very simple and straightforward, but they're actually quite complex to sort of investigate empirically and conceptually. So one of the questions has to do with foregrounding mathematics in the lives of Black learners, and the other is foregrounding the realities of Black life in the context of math learning. And so as you read those two questions, on the surface, they may appear to be the same, but they're actually related questions, but they feed into each other. And there's a couple of concepts that I have been drawing on to focus on the folks who participated in my studies. One is math identity, the other is math socialization. I won't read the entirety of those definitions, but I definitely will leave the slides with Eli and some that you've read my work before, so you know that I tend to fall back on these quite a bit. One has to do with the experiences that Black learners have, and the other has to do with how those experiences are internalized and appropriated, and how they are used to help folks form notions of the self, particularly math identity. And I do this work in the context of several overlapping layered frameworks. You see the questions at the bottom there, and as you work towards the top, these are different frameworks that I've incorporated into my work over the last several years. And working through these frameworks and working through these two questions partly explains how I'm going to address my position today on equity and inclusion. Given that I've been doing this work for so long, I have to make some acknowledgement that at least in the past 20 years, we've gained some traction and some movement away from prior deficit perspectives. And so in the past 20 years or so, there's been some conceptual and methodological space that's opened up for non-deficit phenomenological perspectives of Black learners, focusing on issues of socialization, identity, resilience, agency, success, and a number of other strengths-focused areas. However, and I'm really just going to focus on the last bullet here. You can take your pick of the first 5 critiques of the existing literature, but one of the issues that continues to motivate me is that as I look across the work that's been done with Black children, I think it continues to be dogged by the fact that the primary modes of engaging Black children, Black learners in math contexts are through diagnosis of deficits, remediation, repair, and assimilation. And given that, one of the issues that really motivates me to offer up this kind of critique that I'll be talking about over the next several minutes is the fact that many Black children continue to experience dehumanizing and violent forms of math education. And what I'm going to try to do today and also in the paper is sort of root these forms of violence in the projects of white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and racial capitalism. And I know that's quite a big ask, and it's a pretty steep task to do, but I'm driven to continue to do this kind of work to sort of make liberatory and emancipatory ways of learning and engaging in mathematics possible for Black children. So I have to be intellectually honest about how their lives, not just their mathematical lives, but their entire lives are often shaped and framed and rooted in their negotiations of white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and racial capitalism. So in the paper, I raise a number of questions and offer some analysis, primarily structural. And I'm not going to read these first 3 questions, they're in the paper. But what these questions have pushed me to do is to think about the fact that, as I said earlier, equity and inclusion in math education are insufficient justice models. They gain us some purchase and they gain us some traction, but when you put them up against white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and racial capitalism, it's essentially an unfair fight, right? It's an unfair fight. So we can think about that in this way. This is kind of the vision that we have for equity and inclusion, that equity, inclusion, and a number of other these terms and movements that we can think of, standards-based practices, standards-based movements, et cetera. When we put those together with equity and inclusion, that they will somehow counterweight, in fact, overcome white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and racial capitalism. And of course, we know that's not the case. The reality is that these are pretty hefty foes, right? They're hefty in a way where, again, the thinking is that they're hefty to the degree that equity, inclusion, benevolence, diversity standards, they stand in opposition, but they're just not hefty enough to overcome this. And what I'm doing in the paper is pushing back on this perspective, right? So let me go back for a second. This is the vision, right? This is the reality. And I think there's one more consideration. So the other consideration is the fact that they don't stand in opposition. Equity and inclusion don't stand in opposition necessarily to white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and racial capitalism, so forth and so on. They often work in concert with, and they work in concert with these political projects so that Black children's collective liberation, humanity, and dignity in mathematics education is thwarted, okay? Not in every singular case, obviously, but we're talking about sort of the collective condition of Black learners. So this is the crux of the argument that I'm making, that equity and inclusion are not the antidotes. In fact, they sometimes are part of the problem because of how equity and inclusion are linked to, as I say in the abstract, white sensibilities and white logics. And what I'll try to do in the remaining minutes of this sort of first part is just map out some of the arguments in the paper or some of the arguments that may have informed the fuller arguments in the paper. So one of the things I'm interested in, I borrowed this from some of my colleagues in Brazil. And this is not something that you see in the paper if you had a chance to look at it, but I'm really interested in how these multi-level, what I call projects of inclusion and exclusion, sort of work together to create the conditions where Black children, in fact, don't, at the end of the day, don't experience equity and inclusion in ways that are actually meaningful. And so my colleagues have, and this is a very simple depiction, obviously it can be made much more complicated, but this is just sort of macro, micro levels of inclusion. And their focus is on how macro inclusion can actually lead to micro inclusion. So the fact that we open up the gates at one level, but at a more micro level, we still experience exclusion for different groups. In this case, I'm talking about Black children. And the red arrows are just my additional considerations of how sort of macro inclusion can sometimes still facilitate macro exclusion, and also how micro inclusion can in fact lead to micro exclusion. And there's a number of other permutations and combinations that you can probably think of. Now, what's important about this framework that I didn't have at the time that I was writing the paper is that they framed these forms of inclusion as forms of violence. And in the paper, I speak very explicitly about the kinds of violence that I think Black children experience: epistemological, symbolic, systemic, et cetera. So there's a nice merging of my consideration of these political projects that I'll be talking about and these issues of inclusion and exclusion and how they sort of work together in collusion with the result being that Black children never really fully actualized themselves in mathematics to the degree that they could under different conditions. So one of the examples I use comes from my colleagues, Valerie Faulkner, Lee Stiff, and others at North Carolina State University, where they actually took a look at the Eccles data set from, I believe it was 1988 to 1998, 1999. And these are national data sets where they follow a group of kindergartners throughout their educational trajectories. And they looked at the 1998-99 data set to see what happened to these math placement profiles among Black and white students, looking at algebra placement in particular. And what they found, this kind of troubles the notion of inclusion, that they found essentially that teacher recommendations at the point of algebra placement were impacting Black students to the degree that Black students, even when they were performing well, were not gaining access to algebra. Okay, and the researchers went into the study without a race-based framework. They didn't have a race-based framework going in, but by the time that came out, they concluded Black students faced tremendous obstacles to gaining access to algebra. And in fact, their chances of being placed were reduced. And I think they say here from 2/3 to 2/5 compared to their white peers. And what I found remarkable about this story was that the authors said the following: Black students confront an untenable impediment in that their Blackness, or as we suggest here, the teacher's implicit responses to these students' Blackness, serves as an invisible obstacle to gaining access to higher level mathematics courses, irrespective of their demonstrated performance. Okay, so this is the kind of study that for me begins to trouble this notion of what does it mean for Black students to actually be included into these, what we consider to be white spaces. So even when they do well, right, there's something about their Blackness that sort of emerges that prevents gatekeepers and teachers, for example, from allowing Black students to fully flourish. Okay, so we have to think really carefully about what is happening around these notions of inclusion and exclusion. We've perhaps opened up a set of gates at a different level, but down at this level, the meso level and the micro level, Black students are still experiencing this form of exclusion. So what it says to me is that formulating mathematics, for example, as a gatekeeper is probably not the right kind of discourse to engage in, right? There are, in fact, several gates, right? You open up one gate, then another gate is there, then another gate is there, and another gate is there. So it's a continual battle, again, in these white spaces, these very privileged spaces that are often reserved around whiteness for Black students to continue to make their way through. So this is just one kind of example. And I also, in the paper, work at a different level where I talk about sort of a structural analysis. And I wanted to remind folks who did read the paper that math education is a political project, right? It's a political project in the sense that it has unfolded in parallel, alongside, in concert with, and dialectic with other kinds of political projects that we know have existed in this country, including white supremacy, anti-Blackness, racial capitalism, nationalism, xenophobia, militarism, neoliberalism, et cetera. Okay, so these are projects that work together. And part of the analysis in the paper is to give some examples, some episodic examples of when these projects often work together to collude, if you will, to work against Black children's advancement and progress, again, in expressing their full humanity and full humanness inside and outside of mathematics. So there's a chart in the paper. I'm not going to try to dissect this in the short time that I have, but essentially in this chart in column 1 are reforms in math education that date back as far as the 1950s, the new math, and it goes up to contemporary today, the Common Core era. That's in column 1. In column 3, what I've tried to do is map out the dominant racial and political projects of the time, right? There were other projects going on, but I tried to map out at least a few that pertain to race in particular. And so there's interactions, is what I claim in the paper, between column 1, math education as a particular kind of project, and the political projects and racial projects in column 3. And the dialectic across each era is what's important. So for example, in the time of the new math in the 1950s, where the country was trying to enlist the best and the brightest, that could not have included Black folks in this country, right? 1950, 1957, 1955, for a number of historical reasons that we're aware of, right? So that was a discourse about inclusion, bringing more people in. But the larger surround and the political projects that were unfolding were certainly projects that were in fact antithetical to Black progress, and they were in fact dehumanizing to keep Black people out of these contexts. So you have the contradictions of inclusion and exclusion happening at the same time. You can actually map this. This is a really good dissertation for somebody who wants to take it on, because I didn't do it in the paper. But you can also look at other eras. The standards-based era started in the 1980s, right, up to the late 2000s. You look at this and you see that the standards-based era unfolded at the same time. You had neoconservatism, you had Reagan-Clinton era neoliberalism, you had the new Jim Crow, you had mass incarceration, you had neoliberal racism, and then we also can talk about the Bush era neoconservatism, right? So there are agendas floating around in column 3 that are appropriating the agendas floating around in column 1. And in fact, if you look at the dialectics in the documents, the policy documents at that time, much of it was focused on inclusion, bringing Black and brown folks into math, women into math, all under the guise of, for example, nationalism, internationalism, globalism, so forth and so on. So these projects in column 3 were enlisting the help of the project, Math Education Project in column 1. And of course, we could do a similar analysis of where we are right now, Common Core versus think about what's happening in the world at this point. We've transitioned from one presidency to the other, and there's some hope that this transition will feed back into column 1, but I'm less optimistic than that. So that's one of the things I attempted to do in the paper. And what I want to point out really quickly here is these 2 boxes here. So starting in the 1980s, early 1980s, late 1980s, up until now, that's what a 30-year history. And if you look at actually what has resulted in taking this as just one indicator of Black mathematics majors, we try to sort of recruit, groom students, and we want them to show up on college campuses, for example. The red line, the blue line is the number of math majors that are represented by African Americans over about the same amount of time, right? Those second 2 boxes on the previous table, about the same amount of time. And that number's remained flat. That number has remained flat. So despite all the rhetoric and discourse around inclusion, reform, equity, so forth and so on, the actual number of math majors, African American Black math majors, has remained fairly flat, right? Now there's a number of confounding factors for that, but you have to ask yourself, given all those attempts to incorporate that discourse, the project of math education across that time, how is it that this hasn't really moved the needle? And then you can also look at what's happened in terms of degrees, if we use degree as one indicator of inclusion, for example. So in the early part of the 90s, there was some increase. The red line here is the percentage of math degrees is what I'm really looking at. There was some level of increase. Numbers are small, so the percentages are probably going to be more drastic than they are. And then you can see that around the late 1990s, the numbers started to drop off, right? So the idea of inclusion started to reverse itself. And we are now at a point where those numbers are probably holding flat. So there's this myth around reform and inclusion that somehow it results in a greater number of math majors at the collegiate level, for example. And so I want to kind of wrap up by giving you a couple of characterizations of inclusion, and then I want to offer a little bit of commentary on what I include at the back of the paper. So for me, this is one way to think about Black inclusion into these white spaces. I haven't defined white spaces, but I mean white institutional space is the term that I'm referencing in the paper. You have a white institutional space, you introduce a small number of Black folks, and part of what I'm claiming is that because these are white institutional spaces, they self-correct, they adapt, and they don't fundamentally change their character. So over time, Black folks are in these spaces, and they're still there, and they're still there, and they're still there. And if you look very carefully, they're still there. They haven't become white. The Black folks are still there, but the space itself has self-corrected, right? It's responded to Black inclusion in a way where it maintains the overall character of whiteness and commitment to whiteness, and it remains a white functioning space. And this is what we see in many different instances, sort of at a larger meso and macro level. So how do we begin to move beyond equity and inclusion in ways that are meaningful in the lives, individually and collectively, for Black folks in this country? So we have to think about the way that this system welcomes us or doesn't welcome. This is a quote from one of my participants in one of my prior studies, and she says, this system, and she specifically says the word system, she says, this system is not designed for African-American children to learn. This system is designed for European children, and I believe that until the day I die. That is the reason why these kids are not doing well. African-Americans have got to stop giving so much power to this system. That's why we are in the condition that we are in. We give up power, so now we're in this dilemma. We thought desegregation is what she said segregation. I think she meant desegregation was it. And that's the worst thing that's ever happened to us. People didn't care about our kids. We were shoving our kids into places where people hated them. How are you going to teach somebody you hate? Okay. So I think that's a very powerful commentary on this notion of inclusion, that we somehow have to just get more Black kids into white spaces. So what I'm proposing in this paper, and there's a companion paper that I didn't send ahead of time, but folks should feel free to reach out to me after the presentation. There's a paper that I wrote with my colleagues, Moore and Price, where we talk about systemic violence. And at the end of that paper, we propose what we're calling a Black liberatory math education. And that's based on the premise of self-determination. And this is a quote from the book, Black Power, all right? I'm not gonna read the entire quote, but we have to begin to think about what Black people want, what Black people need, and all their diversity and complexity. And we have to build from there. So the idea that we are only framed, if you think about that picture that I showed you with the profiles against those white spaces, those Black profiles only come into sort of relief against the backdrop of whiteness, right? We need to move away and begin to think about self-determinist efforts and what Black people want and the resources that they need to be able to, to work in the directions that are much more meaningful for them. And so rather than including Black folks into white spaces, we need to be thinking much more seriously about Black spaces and Black people, right? Black spaces and Black people. Now, I know some of you might say, what do you mean Black spaces? I've been thinking of a number of different kinds of spaces that Black people would define for themselves as Black spaces, where there's some level of control and agency on their terms and not necessarily on the terms of other folks. So we do propose, partly at the end of this paper where we talk about refusal in and refusal of, but we propose in a more elaborated way in the other paper what we're calling a Black liberatory math education, and it's about framing and practice, right? It's about framing and practice. And this framing and practice has to do with the kind of math education that is worthy of Black children, right? Not the other way around, where we're looking for Black children that are worthy of math education, but the kind of math education that is worthy of Black children and allows them to flourish in their humanity and brilliance, unfettered by those political projects that I mentioned before. Now, it's kind of utopian, but it's not impossible. So in terms of the framing, we believe, my colleagues and I, but especially myself, believe that this particular kind of math education that we're calling a Black liberatory math education, and we see some seeds perhaps, it prioritizes liberation over integration and freedom. It's not about separation, right? Separation, it's not necessarily what we're saying here. It's skeptical of liberal notions of inclusion and equity. And these appeals to democracy and citizenship. I talk in the paper about how citizenship is held up as a carrot, right, to entice Black folks to participate in these particular kinds of political projects, to embrace particular kinds of capitalism, which of course may be their undoing. It refuses all these forms of violence that we talk about in the paper: epistemological, systemic, symbolic, structural. And it says that the freedom to participate, integrate in, and be included into anti-Black spaces is not freedom. Right? It's not freedom. It's never going to be freedom to just include Black folks into these spaces that fundamentally self-correct, right, and adapt and maintain their character. And we say that there's nothing wrong with learning mathematics, right? So I don't want people to get the impression that I'm saying, are you saying Black kids and Black learners should not? No, I'm saying the purposes matter. And so this is from S.E. Anderson from 1970. And some of you know S.E. Anderson is on the East Coast up in New York. I think he may still be alive. He's probably in his 90s. He wrote the book Black Holocaust, but he's also written in Math and Science Education. He talks about the need to learn math to struggle against racial capitalism, right? Not to learn math to fit into racial capitalism, but to struggle against it. And so we offer that as a part of the framing. And we talk about practice. And so this is designed first and foremost by liberation-seeking Black people, including parents, caregivers, community members, Black teachers, and Black children, right? And I've elaborated this in other contexts. I don't have time to do it here. But in response to the critique around equity and inclusion, we do offer something up, is part of the point that I'm making. And we have to allow for enough latitude where Black folks can refuse in the system to the point where they may have to refuse the system itself. And I think this moment of COVID is actually providing some instances and examples of how many parents, but especially Black parents, are having to engage in these acts of refusal in the system and of the system because of what's being asked of them and how they began to see the system in different ways. I think some researchers across the country are beginning to document some of this. So we also talk about this in the paper, and I want to stop there because I know I can't be totally expansive, but this is just a peppering of things that I'd like to share with you. And I appreciate you listening and looking forward to the conversation. I think I went a little bit long there.
No, it is perfectly okay.
Sure, sure.
And so we also want to frame this as a discussion. So we just want to make sure that to let the audience know that the chat is open, and that Earl Center team will be kind of moderating the chat in itself. So I mean, I can jump the conversation off. So in reading your paper, I kind of particularly like how you lay out, like, you know, in mathematics education, where we are, where we've been, and where we're hoping to actually go, right? And you connect anti-Blackness in mathematics education to anti-Blackness and the oppressive appropriation in other spaces, and link it to capitalism as well. So just in kind of thinking with the audience and thinking with you, what are the parallels or simultaneous changes that kind of need to occur or are necessary for that liberation in mathematical spaces?
Yeah, so this is where I'm gonna bite a big chunk of the apple, and I'm not gonna be able to eat it all at once, but I'll just say that this is where I would offer something up. So I'm thinking about its scale, and I think the response is probably one of degrees. At the largest scale, we have to talk seriously about reparations in this country, right? We have to seriously talk about reparations in this country. And reparations not as a handout, reparations as a debt that's owed to the beneficiaries of folks in this country who are the descendants of slavery, right? Of the institution of slavery. That's a debt that needs to be owed, that's unpaid, right? So given the resources that are owed to Black folks, that are continues to be denied to Black folks, I think that's step one. We need to have the resources that are owed to us so that we can actually, you know, utilize those resources in the direction and the commitment to self-determination, right? So it's not necessarily that a bunch of things have to, you know, that our freedom has to be contingent on a bunch of things that, let's say, happen in white spaces and white structures, right? And first, we need to be, quote unquote, repaired in the sense of the debt has to be paid. And then once that debt has to be paid, not just cash payments, but then a series of things that have to come along with that. And I could sort of start thinking, what, you know, way out the box, if you will, but I think it's realistic in the context of what's been done, the damage that's been done. So we're talking, you know, cash payments for sure. We're talking protected status in this country for sure. We're talking certain forms of financial relief in terms of, you know, for example, no federal, no state taxes, right? Free college. I could go on, free healthcare. I could go on and on and on. And when I say free, as a part of repayment of the debt. So I think reparations is one of those huge projects that could unfold, that could, you know, over time to the beneficiaries of those folks who were forced to suffer under the national commitment that we've had to anti-Blackness. And then, of course, there are degrees and levels, you know, what should be happening in schools. So in the proposal that my colleagues and I offer, that I offered partly in the NCTM talk, but also in this paper, we talk about some basic practices that should unfold in community contexts where Black parents, caregivers, folks who are charged with caring for Black children take specific roles in determining who gets to teach their children, right? The kind of assessments that are used against their children and with their children. Black children should have the ability to screen their teachers, right? Who's teaching me? They should. So there are a number of practical things. So I've kind of given you a big macro level and a more practical thing that may seem a little bit utopian, but I think if we're going to take Black freedom and liberation seriously, we should be able to move towards those things.
Can I jump in and interject, right? So when, especially when we talk about like the mathematical, the educational spaces in itself, right? So the paper calls like for teachers, researchers, and administrators and teacher educators like myself to kind of engage and like do things differently, right? And I know you just named like kind of like the practical thing, but what are like other responsibilities that educators should be kind of mindful of? And like what does this call like teachers to do in classrooms or schools or in their communities in themselves?
Yeah, and we have some good examples of people who are working in teacher education around the country. I mean, this notion, of teacher, critical self-reflection, sort of reflection on the self. Even in one of the books that we wrote for the field for teachers, our Rethinking book, we asked teachers, math teachers in particular, to start with the self, right? To examine your own math identities, your own math histories, your own ideas about agency, your own ideas about brilliance and competency. Think about your own experiences as a learner, right? So you can begin to not just sympathize, but empathize with the idea that you play a role in shaping the mathematical and other identities of the children that you teach. You are an agent of their socialization. That's a huge responsibility, right? If you're not cut out for that work, don't do it. If you're not cut out for that work, don't do it. It is hard, it is difficult. And yes, that means getting to know in a genuine way who takes care of your children, right? And respecting the fact that the way that plays out in community and home context may not be the way that you expect it to play out, but you have to understand what that reality might be like, and you have to sort of go from there. You may wish something different for the child may wish something different for themselves, but given where they are, you have to understand that in sort of local and broader context, right? For example, the stereotype that, you have poor Black parents. Well, poor Black parents didn't come into the world wanting to be poor, right? They didn't come into the world wanting to be poor. So part of your responsibility as a teacher is to think about, how is poverty imposed on the children that I teach, right? Not how do they navigate being poor, but how is poverty actually imposed on them? And what can I do as a math teacher to, alleviate some of that? That's a huge burden and huge responsibility, but it's part of the work. So a lot of it starts with that self-reflection. And then we go on, and I'm referring to these books, but we go on to talk about, the kind of feedback that you offer to your children, right? In what ways is that affirming of their mathematical and racial and other identities? In what ways does that diminish? We talk about the way that you communicate with parents, for example, or caregivers. So there's a lot of practical sort of things that you can do in the way of honoring and respecting the identities that students bring to the table, individually and collectively and community-wise. But it's work. It's real work that has to be done, right? It's real work. And I think it's not absent the content, right? Because you also have to respect the brilliance of the students that come in front of you. So you have to be willing to not just work from the floor, right? We got to start here. You also have to be thinking about, expanding their ceilings, if you will, right? Yeah. Challenging and that kind of thing. So, I could go on, but there's a number of folks who are much more versed in this, who are giving us bits and pieces of that puzzle. But it does start with the self.
And kind of placing or piecing that picture as we kind of lifting as we climb. We do have a question in the chat. What role do Black teachers play in reimagining what mathematics education can be for Black students?
Yeah, so we specifically, and I specifically inserted the phrase liberation seeking. And this is not a diminishment of the diversity that might exist among Black teachers or Black people. Not to say that everybody has to be, on code in that way, if you will. Yep. But if we're sticking with kind of the theme of where I'm coming from, so liberation seeking Black teachers, who see themselves through fictive kinship as connected to the Black kids that they teach, for example, we need those kinds of teachers. We need those kinds of teachers. Now, I'm saying that in the sense that I'm saying we need those teachers in the system that we have, right? But I think that's okay. That's okay in the system that we have as we continue to build new and different systems, right? Absent those kinds of teachers, liberation-seeking Black teachers who see those Black children, or, specifically in the fictive kinship way, as part of the family, as part of the historical family, as part of the local family, absent those teachers, then we are doing a lot of what we do in programs across the country, where we try to convince non-Black teachers to do the work, right, in particular ways. We're trying to sell them on the idea of teaching Black children. I think liberation-seeking Black teachers don't have to be sold on the idea of teaching Black children. I taught a course, I know I'm taking a little bit long with my answers, but I taught a course last fall on Black intellectual thought in education. And I taught that course because I specifically wanted to go back into history and look at what people were doing coming out of enslavement, for example, right? Starting those, freedmen schools, and what Nannie Helen Burroughs and Fannie Mae Coppin and Anna Julia Cooper were doing when they were building their institutions, right? To teach Black children, the kind of expectations that they had and the kind of goals that they were setting for Black children that were in the context of a different version of white supremacy and anti-Blackness. We can learn from Black teachers, liberation-seeking Black teachers, in those ways. And in that course, we even covered, the so-called debate. There was really no real debate between Booker T and Du Bois, right? Both of them were liberation-seeking educators in their own way, right? They were liberation-seeking educators in their own way. And so we have to, cautiously bring more Black teachers into this system so that we can help Black children understand the nature of this system, and so they can sort of get themselves out of the system, right? So I think that's important, but not just commodifying Black teachers, not just commodifying them, for the purpose of just having Black bodies. That I would not support at all, and I've never supported that.
Okay. And it believes, so what role do Black independent schools and community-based Black-led institutions have in disrupting public school mathematics education structures?
Yeah, the answer is built into the question. So in that same course, we did talk about Black independent schools. So John Rickford has a really nice book, is that We Are an African People. That book is excellent. It's an excellent history of the schools that were started in New York. I forget the area, the Black Panther schools, and even here in Chicago. Some of you know Dr. Carol Lee. She has some charter schools, but they function in some ways in that same independent spirit. So in that course, the conversation did bubble up and percolate to where I think there was some recognition that we need independent Black institutions, in the spirit of self-determination, right? And it's not an abandonment of the public education system. It's not segregation. It is about preserving life and humanity for Black children. Like that parent who said we're sending our Black kids into spaces where people hate them, right? That's you have to take that thing seriously. You have to take that seriously. So I think there is some space in the landscape for that. I think we're going to see an increasing number of Black parents who are going to marshal whatever resources they can to keep their children home, right? And they're going to find ways to do that. And again, it's not an abandonment of the public education system. What they're saying is that this version of public education does not work. We are committed to public education, but this version does not work. And I urge everybody to go back and look at Du Bois's 1935 paper, Does the Negro Need Separate Schools? Right? It's a really interesting argument because you think he's going in one direction, but at the end of the paper, he comes back and he talks about not just independent Black schools, but the kind of education that is worthy of Black children, right? So yes, it's about the kind of institution, but it's also about the kind of education, right? We need meaningful education for Black children, right? And the context is important, but we have to find meaningful education. So just because you build an independent Black institution, right, doesn't mean, but we would hope that the juxtaposition of all those things, independent Black institution, that there's a purpose for that. But just because it's a Black teacher or a Black school, let's just say that doesn't mean that, it's going to empower in the ways that are implicit to what I'm saying. So we need the kind of independent Black schools that are going to make sure that Black children learn unfettered by whiteness and anti-Blackness and white supremacy, right? All
right. If If the push to include more Black and Latinx students in exam schools, historically white spaces, is a flawed theory of inclusion as opposed to liberation.
Mhm. Can you reframe that?
Hold on. I'm having my internet just
No, that's fine.
is shaky. Anyone from the team want to, it kind of just left the screen.
I can jump in. So the question is, if the push to include more Black and Latinx students in exam schools, which are historically white spaces, I don't know if we might have to define an exam school.
Yeah.
Okay, so, Greg, do you want to give a brief blurb about what that is?
Exam schools in Boston, you basically have to kind of test in.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Selective enrollment is what we call them here in Chicago.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So it's, I guess I have to be a little clearer. So it's not a total dismissal of white spaces. What I'm saying, if you remember that picture that I put up where you include the inclusion, and I'm saying that the system simply self-corrects and adapts. That's where my problematic is. Right? That's where my problematic is that the thinking is behind these inclusion and equity discourses that the mere inclusion of more Black and brown students, right, is enough to satisfy the justice claims that are behind, students who come from those groups. And I'm saying that's not the case. Mere inclusion, and it's an old argument, mere inclusion is so far from the solution, right? So what do we need to do to transform those spaces? Why do they have to be selective enrollment schools in the first place, for example, right? Why can't every child have that quality of education, right? And I hate to sort of go to the every child discourse, but why can't all Black children, why can't all Black and brown children have access to that kind of education without having to, engage in the testing regime, which we know has a history that's rooted in eugenics and a number of other things. Why should we even have to play that game, right? So it's almost like the question itself preserves the thing, right? And I'm not sure if we need to preserve these things, right? These constructed spaces, right? These places where we're letting them maintain their essence. We don't need to let them maintain their essence. There should not be selective enrollment schools and testing schools in, unfettered and unchallenged, and parents are attempting to do that. And you see the pushback, right? You see the pushback in terms of New York, right? You see the New York City pushback in terms of what parents, mainly white parents, and surprisingly, a larger number, an increasing number of Asian American parents. That happened in San Francisco also at one of the very, I think it's Lowell High School, right? You see this kind of preservation, this kind of attempt to preserve these spaces, right? And those spaces perhaps should not, we should be questioning those spaces, right? So I'm gonna flip the question in that way and just say, I think we have to question that. Whether those kinds of schools should not be made available to everybody. Right? Why not?
Coming back to the premise.
Yeah.
Thanks for that. We have another question in the chat. What can I, as a non-Black teacher in an urban district that has signed on to this model of equity and inclusion in schools, do right now for my current students?
So I have to say this kind of respectfully. So there's two ways to parse out an answer to that. One is there's the kind of solution on demand. What do I do when I go back to I just listened to you, what do I do when I go back to my school? Part of me wants to resist that because context is important, right? Context is important. I need to know about your community, your school, your working conditions, the nature of the advocacy agency in your community. So, you can see why I'm reluctant to want to answer it, to give you like a magic bullet to go back and do, right? So rather than telling you specifically what you need to do in your context, I will say this. When you leave this talk, think seriously about how you're going to engage with the ideas that you heard me say, and also what you read in the paper, right? How would you engage? How would you, even if you disagree, how would you counter the ideas? How would you appropriate them and make them on your own, right? And so part of my responsibility, given my positionality, is to offer up a reframing, some conceptual tools, some linguistic tools that you can now perhaps make your own, appropriate and make your own, and then you can then do what you need to do locally in your context, right? If I knew what that context was, if I were there with you every day, I could say, oh, maybe we should do this, maybe we should do this. We could adjust here and adjust there. So what I'm offering in a talk like this are some conceptual and linguistic tools and some experiential knowledge that you might be able to take with you to do what you think is necessary in the spirit of, working with your students in a meaningful way. So for example, now that you have heard this, if you hadn't thought about this partial reframing of equity and inclusion, how might you introduce that into the conversation? To say, wait a second, are we really, maybe not in a risky way where you're going to lose your job, but are we really appealing to white sensitivities and white logic when we do this, right? To what degree are we doing that? Or are we interested in equity and inclusion to the degree that we're also going to speak honestly about white supremacy, even when nobody in the room claims to be a white supremacist or a racist, right? Can we have honest conversations about that? So I think that's what one might be able to take away from a conversation like this, right? Conceptual linguistic tools that can then be put in practice in ways that are relevant to your specific context, as opposed to me telling you from afar, this is what to do with children that I don't see, that I don't know, that I haven't experienced in any meaningful way with you, in the same way that you would know. And shout out to Ada, and I believe it's Okun, whose presentation I did manage in the mess of AERA to see, and I thought I was very, very impressed by that. In fact, she was on my shout out list, but I wasn't sure if I should do it, but I see her name in the chat. Very, very good presentation, by the way. You have a stellar student on your hands over there.
Danny, we have, thank you for that. And we have one last question that is really, that was a perfect segue into what would this work look like? So also in response to the liberal call for equity and inclusion, what can and should the refusal of dehumanizing and violent mathematics education look like in principle and practice? Yeah. What would this work look and sound like with teachers and pre-service teachers, especially given the majority of teachers in our schools are white and were raised and educated in white-centered environments? Yeah, the risky business of refusal. I'll turn to my my colleague Rochelle Gutierrez, who you might want to invite for a talk down the line. She talks about this idea of, and she's more of an expert than me in this area. She talks about this idea of creative insubordination. Right? What can teachers do? And I'm assuming she's talking to pre-service teachers as well, but teachers in the field and practice, what can they do in their classrooms, in their spaces, right? In the way of insubordination, kind of insubordination that is protective of their children, right? Where can you resist and where can you refuse? That might be a practice, in your context that you transform, right? The larger practice from, let's say, the meso level comes down to the micro level. The meso level orientation is X, right? In your practice, you transform that to be Y, right? And the reason you would transform that is because now you are attuned to the damage that this practice could have on your children, right? Engaging in the kind of learning that might come from, an engagement like this. So I would say, turning to folks like her with specific recommendations around this creative insubordination would be part of my answer. Yes, somebody in epistemic disobedience from my colleague Greg Larnell as well. Yes.
Pusa natin base la. Ki problem ni? Mas natin base?
Somebody. All right. All right. And we just want to be mindful and be respectful of everyone's time. So Danny, I want to say thank you for actually
Thank you.
coming by, and you know what? Thank you for your time, your effort, your energy, the love that you were kind of able to kind of express, one that is needed and is like really not talked about as much. So I want to thank you for having, especially inspiring. Like,
You're very welcome. You're very welcome.
yeah, and we want to thank all those in the audience that were able to attend. The talk will be posted and shared online. Just give us some time to kind of repost. Any closing thoughts, comments, or concerns from the Earl Center family?
Many thanks, Danny.
No, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny.
Thank you. I appreciate the conversation format. It's not a long presentation, but I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
All right. So thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Thanks,
Take care.
everyone. Take
Bye,
care.
folks. Bye for now.
All right.